my family took a tropical vacation to Canada, to Montreal. Okay, maybe the winter hats give it away that it was not a tropical vacation. This was the wrong year to head north instead of south with this long, hard winter we've had. But when we were en route flying back home, I received a call from my mom, and she said that my dad was in the dying process. And this was kind of like whiplash for us. It wasn't completely unexpected because he had been declining in the last year and was at eventide. But we just weren't expecting it then. And it was just so hard to switch gears from being on vacation to coming home to say goodbye to my dad. And we joined my sister and my mom, who were already here with him. And then the next day, my other sister was able to fly in, and we stood vigil. We held hands with him, we prayed, we sang songs, we visited at his bedside, and we hoped that he would live long enough so that my brother could say goodbye to him too. And my brother flew in the next day, and my brother was able to speak to my dad before he died. And my brother was sharing these beautiful words with my dad. And then he said, Dad, he started talking about this huge falling out that they'd had years before on a hunting trip. And all of the rest of us leaned in and were wondering, we never had any idea that my brother and dad had this huge falling out. And my brother was sharing how terrible it was. And then he said, Dad, I want you to know, I let it go. I'm at peace, even though we will never see eye to eye on whether it's okay to answer the call of nature by the deer stand or away from it. That's not what my family was expecting either. And it was this moment of where the tension broke, where we could share a laugh together as a family, and we knew that my dad would crack up if he were able to respond. And a few minutes later, the really wonderful CNA who'd been caring for us came in, and she adjusted my dad, and then she said, okay, he's going home now. Everybody gather around. And she moved the bed away from the wall so that we could encircle my dad. And we all put our hands on him, and we said our goodbyes, and we prayed the Lord's Prayer. And he breathed a few more times, and that was it. He died. It's often in those moments where we come face to face with death, where we realize the preciousness and miracle of life. It's often when we experience the absence of something that we realize how precious it is. We treasure the sunlight and the daylight when we've endured a long, hard night. We can treasure the signs of spring and new life when we have endured a long, harsh winter. We can treasure those mountaintop moments when we have endured the suffering in the valley. Priest and author Richard Rohr says that suffering is universal. All of us experience suffering at some point, and a lot of times there's not a reason or an understanding for why the suffering happens. He defines suffering as any time we have a loss of control. Anytime we realize that things are beyond us, that we can't control them, is a time of suffering. And he says suffering shouldn't be glorified, but he said suffering is that one experience where we realize our need for something bigger, something that can hold us up and sustain us in the midst of things beyond our control. This Easter story that I shared with you about Jesus and the tomb, this is a story that started out as a story of suffering, a story of death, a story where Jesus' disciples had been following him and they thought he would start a revolution, and then circumstances beyond their control started to take over and they watched Jesus die. That was not what they expected. And then Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, and in John's account, she's by herself. And I wonder if she was by herself because Mary Magdalene was an outcast. Before Jesus took notice of her, people just called her a terrible sinner and that she was worthless. Jesus called her a forgiven sinner and said that she was a child of God. Maybe she didn't have people to grieve with, so she came to grieve for the one person who said she had worth and value. But on top of the loss of control of losing Jesus, she also comes to the tomb and she realizes it is empty. And that must have brought more confusion and loss of control. And she goes and finds a few disciples, Simon Peter, and it says, the one whom Jesus loved. Now, we don't know who that disciple is, but he's referred to a number of times throughout John's gospel as the one whom Jesus loved. And some people theorize that that could be us. Maybe it's holding that place for you or for me as we read this story, so that we can place ourselves in the events of Jesus' life and death and resurrection and be that disciple whom Jesus loved. But they came running as well, and they looked, and they walked around in this tomb, and that must have been eerie. And they couldn't make sense of it. Where would you take the body, but yet the linen wrappings are still there? And then they went home. But Mary just stays there. Mary is just weeping, grieving at the tomb, and she then looks into the tomb for herself. And this time when she looks in, she sees angels. And to make a story even stranger, she has a conversation with these angels. And the one thing that I find so interesting is that when she's talking to them, she still refers to Jesus as her Lord. She said, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Even in death, she still called him Lord. The other disciples, when they saw Jesus die, they scattered. They said, "Well, we thought he was the Lord. We thought he was the one, but he died." They went back to square one. Even in death, though, Mary said, "This is my Lord." And then she turns around and she sees someone who she thinks is the gardener, and it's Jesus. And he talks to her. And then he says something that finally gets her attention. He says, "Mary." He says her name. And it's in that moment where he says her name that she experiences recognition. In that moment where he says her name, he transforms her suffering into a sense of belonging, into a sense of purpose again, into the possibility of new life. That's where he meets her. Throughout this season of Lent, which leads us up to Easter, we've been doing a teaching series in the congregation following a book called Creed, understanding our Christian beliefs, what we believe and why. And it follows the Apostles' Creed, and the very last chapter of this book is called Resurrection, what we believe about the resurrection. And the author says this: "By conquering death, Jesus addressed our fear and uncertainty and offered his first disciples and us a peace that sustains us even in the face of great tragedy and pain." We are met with a peace by going through Jesus' death and then resurrection together. Every year, when we're leading up to the day of Easter, we observe special Holy Week activities. We have extra church services where we trace the events of Jesus' life, the triumphant entry into Jerusalem that Deacon Julie helped lead our kids through, the time where Jesus prayed in the garden, sharing in the Last Supper with the disciples, and then Good Friday, where we recognize how Jesus was crucified and died. We walk through all of these events so that we can taste the power of them, so that when we get to Easter morning, the resurrection of Jesus, we can also taste the power of God's presence in a new way. But sadly, we don't have to wait each year for Holy Week and Good Friday to experience suffering. We know what suffering is like because life just happens to offer it here and there when we least expect it. We know suffering when we're all of a sudden given a frightening health diagnosis. We know suffering and a loss of control when someone we love dies. We know this feeling of suffering when a marriage falls apart, when an addiction takes over, when a friend dies from suicide, when changes happen in our lives and in our world and in our families that we are not prepared or equipped for, we know what suffering feels like. So we can also know the power of the resurrection all through the whole year. Richard Rohr says this about what Jesus' death and resurrection do. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, we learn how to hold, make use of, and transform our suffering into a new kind of life instead of an old kind of death. So we don't get rid of our suffering, deny our suffering, pretend it doesn't exist. We learn how to hold on to it, how to have it transformed by God. Being a Christian, following Jesus, doesn't give us a pass from suffering and hard things. It doesn't help us avoid the hard things of life. No, following Jesus means that we believe that there is something holding us up, even when everything else is out of our control. Even when we go through times of deep suffering, we realize there's something else, that we're not in it all by ourselves. That's maybe also why we say the creed when we worship and when we baptize children. We say this creed to remind us who this God is, what this God has been through on our behalf. And we look at the last part of the creed, that part of the last part of the book on resurrection, and we say, I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. The creed ends where Easter begins. The creed ends where Easter begins, where we are reminded that this God is walking with us each and every day. So on this Easter morning, I invite you into the presence of a power greater than yourself. I invite you into the presence of a living God, one who has tasted death. I invite you to the presence of a good God, one who has battled evil. I invite you into the presence of a powerful God who also made himself vulnerable for our sake. And when we meet this God in the various things that we go through each and every day in our lives, we can say with Mary, I have seen the Lord. And we can announce that to other people who may be hurting, may be needing to hear that message, that there is a God with them when everything else is out of control. There is something holding them. I got to sing a song at my dad's funeral that could be kind of like a creed, because it states where we see the presence of God in the good times and in the hard times. Thy holy wings, O Savior, spread gently over me, and let me rest securely through good and ill in thee. Oh, be my strength and portion, my rock and hiding place, and let my every moment be lived within thy grace. Happy Easter. Amen.